Hey everyone, I'm Houston Paul. I'm going to be doing a podcast today on the 1954 CIA coup in Guatemala that ended the revolution. Uh, it's interesting, actually, this seemingly rotten banana almost caused a nuclear war. And as you can see, this is a product of Guatemala. But Ernesto Guevara, world renowned Marxist revolutionary, became Che, both in name and ideology, in Guatemala. And then, of course, after the revolution, he goes to Mexico to meet up with the Castro brothers. And the Cuban Revolution causes the Bay of Pigs operation by the CIA, which was based on the 1954 coup. Both led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as we know, the world almost ended there. But this takes us to the October Revolution. It ended decades of authoritarian rule amid international anti fascism after World War II. And this was a coup of students and workers led by army officers. And one of these, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, takes over in 1944 and actually allows for democracy in what begins the Decade of Spring. And as we can see here, this is Arbenz and the next president, Arevalo, exchanging power. Guatemalan democracy. We have 1945. Revelo takes over with a 85% majority, surprisingly, and he begins this New Deal type legislation based on his spiritual socialism, and it's broad reforms ranging from laborers and workers. That's the idea of the reform. Uh, this one company, United Fruit, lobbies the State Department and CIA, and they pay the press, and they begin sort of a red scare against Guatemala. The irony is that Arevalo was explicitly anti-communist and suppressed the Communist Party. He wrote a book called The Shark and the Sardines, and it was about U.S. neocolonialism in Latin America. He denounced this, the U.S. being a shark attacking the defenseless sardines, basically, and he made a claim that Wall Street, the State Department, and the Pentagon were acting all as the same worldwide entity to affect policy elsewhere. And this pretty much defined the struggle of Guatemala after the Arbenz regime. Uh, Enter Arbenz, March 1951, he becomes president. He says Guatemala needs radical change, and he begins this national capitalism, which he wants to compete with the big foreign monopolies. So he builds an Atlantic highway and a port to compete with United Fruit, who acts more as a supranational organization now, acting beyond the state. His 1952 land reform was his biggest policy he enacted. It was also known as Decree 900. The idea was simple. It was going to expropriate idle land, compensate the original owners, and then redistribute it to the peasants. And in a land where 2% owned 70% of the land, this was a drastic change. And even Arbenz gave up about 1,700 acres of land. By 1954, 100,000 peasant families had received parcels of land for their own farming. The failure in this was that his radicalization caused many counter-revolutionaries to pop up, mainly because he was taking on the oligarchy and monopolies, unlike his predecessor, El Pulpo, which was their name for United Fruit because it had many tentacles, and pulpo means octopus in Spanish. The tentacles stretched everywhere. They owned 85%, or sorry, 85% of the land they owned was idle and unused. Therefore, by 1954, 400,000 acres had been expropriated. Arbenz looked at their tax records and said, "We'll give you $1 million for all this." And United Fruit said, "Wait now, how about we give you 16, or how about you give us 16 million?" The State Department backed this, though there were many conflicts of interest. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had a law firm that actually advocated for United Fruit, and Sproul Braden, who was an ambassador in Argentina during the Perón era, was a public relations person for United Fruit. By the way, they're now known as Chiquita Bananas, and denounced these policies as straight from the Kremlin. And you can see here, this is the Guatemalan Labor Party, also known as the Communist Party of Guatemala. As far as the communist threat goes, the PGT was legalized in 1952 by Arbenz. Only 4 of the 56 congressmen were actually in the PGT, though he did have a few advisors and people working on the land reforms that were openly communist. However, the CIA said yes, Guatemala is a communist nation under attack by the Kremlin. and they feared a domino effect, which would be if Guatemala fell to communism, other nations in the area would fall. Look at Cuba. Uh, in 1992, flash forward a little bit, we have Nick Cullither. He is a CIA historian who documents the operations of the 1950s in Guatemala, and it's later declassified. And that's my main source for this CIA side of things. He tells us that a military man in Guatemala, Castillo Armas, was funded by the CIA, given weapons, and they had this operation, PB Fortune. But it's blown because Armas brags about it, basically, and they don't want to continue with the operation. This leads up to March 1954. The Organization of American States in Caracas, Venezuela. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles defends. He asked that we defend against communist aggression in this hemisphere and to keep it out of Latin America. Guatemalan Foreign Minister Torriello says that this is an internationalization of McCarthyism. He gives a railing speech and gets massive applause. He's basically a celebrity in all of Latin America for denouncing U.S. imperialism. You can see here the Dulles brothers, John Foster, Secretary of State, and Allen, head of the CIA. Arbenz starts to prepare. He gets the revelation that the CIA is plotting against him. A double agent has penetrated the groups. Arbenz tells the press that the U.S. is plotting something, and they say, "Look, this is propaganda. We're doing nothing in Guatemala." But then they plant Soviet weapons off the coast of Nicaragua, and Arbenz dismisses this as propaganda and just foreign intrigue. Then in 1954, a major incident happens called the Elfim incident. There was an arms embargo against Guatemala. They couldn't purchase any arms to defend against any certain attacks by any nations. So they sent representatives to Prague and Czechoslovakia to strike an arms deal. It was a part of the Soviet bloc, and the Kremlin did approve this arms trade. But the Alfim was a ship, a Swedish vessel carrying weapons to Guatemala. The State Department and CIA knew this because of a Swiss money exchange through a Swiss bank account, and they used this as a reason to invade, and it proved communism in Guatemala. After this, the United States Navy started Operation Hard Rock Baker, which was a naval blockade, much like what we'll see years later in Cuba. The CIA operation is officially called PD Success, and this happens after Eisenhower takes office and begins his new look for containment, which is, instead of sending in the Marines, more focused on nuclear deterrence and using covert operations, such as the 1953 coup in Iran by Kermit Roosevelt. And Allen Dulles, whom I talked about earlier and showed, the brother of John Foster, begins this operation. In December of 1953, he greenlights PB Success and grants $3 million to get Arbenz out of office. There are three planning phases: the propaganda phase, the paramilitary phase, and the political phase, which is to basically get dissonance within the Guatemalan political dynamic. In May '54, we see Operation Sherwood, which is a big part of the propaganda, and leaflets are being airdropped into the capital. Che Guevara actually talks about this, and the CIA begins a radio station, La Voz de la Liberación, which is the voice of the liberation, and they begin disseminating propaganda to a largely illiterate populace. So this is basically where they're getting their news. And the paramilitary phase of it is what predates the invasion. Castillo Armas has about 400,000 CIA trained and equipped troops awaiting the invasion in Honduras. He's going to hit strategic areas by branching out his forces, and they're all going to convene on the Guatemalan capital. And you may think of Armas as riding in his horse in the battle dress like a Napoleon type figure, but really he was wearing a leather jacket and riding in a station wagon across the border into Guatemala. And on June 18th, 1954, the invasion begins. At the same time, as CIA planes buzz a pro-government rally led by Arbenz. 3 days in, half of Armas's troops remain after huge losses, just really humiliated. The CIA wanted him to use guerrilla tactics, but he ended up trying to fight a conventional war, which he couldn't win against the 5,000 strong Guatemalan army. So Armas requests heavy bombardment and reinforcements. The reinforcements he gets in the aid of anti-communist villagers, and this new force as airdrop supplies. CIA planes start hitting Guatemala City from Nicaragua and really begin to demoralize the military, which the officers were the key to victory for Arbenz. He started to lose hope, and Arbenz suggests, look, how about we give those Czech weapons to the populace, let them fight the war for us. And the officers say that's a terrible idea. These newly organized workers and peasants, if they have weapons, they'll overthrow us, and there goes our power. So the army is no longer with Arbenz 100%. Though they do start to build up troops via train, and this causes the CIA to increase air attacks and propaganda bombardment, and they begin to broadcast disinformation to the military, proclaiming battles that weren't won, death tolls that are inaccurate, and it really just goes to demoralize the military brass, and they completely lose support in Arbenz, and they blame his communist ties for the reason why they're being attacked, and it's partly true. But they began to plot to seize power, and they met with the new United States ambassador to Guatemala, Purifoy, and they plot their own coup against Arbenz. 9 days after the invasion begins, Arbenz capitulates, and he cedes power to his second in command under the guarantee that the revolution of 1944 wouldn't be undone. But this is kind of an optimistic hope for what happens. The revolution does end in 1954. In fact, this is called the counter-revolution taking hold. The State Department takes over instead of the CIA. The agents that are left begin Operation PB History, which is where they round up documents of Guatemalan communist ties. They get dozens, well, not dozens, but tens of thousands of documents. It's rather drastic. They even they find Arben's Marxist library and his wife's copy of the Communist Manifesto and Stalin's biography. 11 days after the coup took place on June 27th, there were actually 5 juntas in place. So the government had changed power 6 times in about 12 days. Armas is finally put in power, though. He just goes on to be assassinated in 1957. So it kind of shows the futility of the whole gesture. United Fruit is given their land back because, after all, they were the national interest represented in Guatemala. And in the decades up until about 1996, tens of thousands, upwards of 250,000 Guatemalans died in a dirty war. However, this was proclaimed as a victory over communism. But there you have it. The facts are there. This is the 1954 CIA-led coup in Guatemala that ended the decade of spring. Make your determination. Was communism a true problem in Guatemala, or was this more? Should it be looked at in the Cold War context of a Red Scare? But that's it. Thanks.